Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We will begin in just a few minutes. My name is Diana Samakinwa, and I am the Assistant Director of the African Studies Program at UW-Madison. I'd like to begin by thanking the event sponsors. First, the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, IRIS-NRC, outreach supports and enhances international and global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. IRIS-NRC provides resources and expertise to K-12 teachers and students, post-secondary educators and students, and the community at large. Secondly, the African Studies Program, ASP Outreach, shares the expertise, talents, and scholarship of the University of Wisconsin-Madison to promote the study of Africa in schools and communities across Wisconsin. Please visit africa.wisc.edu to learn more about outreach scholars, the lending collection, and other available resources through ASP to support teaching about Africa. I would also like to thank Essie Lenchner and Carmen Pitts, who are assisting with tech support today. If you require any assistance, please send them a note using the chat box. Just as a reminder, this event is being recorded, but it will only record you when you're speaking. Q&A will be at the end of the lecture, so please type your questions into the chat box. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Safia Jama. Safia is from Kitale, Kenya, and is currently a graduate student in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Safia is a graduate instructor at the Wisconsin School of Business and is passionate about gender equity, especially in the field of education as it relates to the Somali community in Kenya. Without further ado, I will now turn it over to Safia.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you all. I'm so happy to present on this. I loved reading the book and I loved everything about the book as it related to the Somali culture. And I hope we can be able to learn something from it and we can be able to benefit from it as much as I did. So my presentation is not as long. I'm just going to narrate and talk as much as I can. And I hope we'll have a session to ask, we'll have questions to ask at the end during our Q&A session. So the book is When Stars, I don't know why I say When Stars Are Scattered, which is about the Somali refugee communities in Kenya. I am a Somali born in Kenya, and I would first like to acknowledge, because I felt this is really, really important. As I present this, I will first acknowledge that I will be presenting the book based on my identity as a Somali, and there's so much cultural aspects I saw from the book. And I would like to acknowledge my privilege being a Somali Kenyan and not having to live as a refugee. And I felt that this is really, really important to mention as I start this. So I'm going to go through some history and background of the Dadaab refugee camp. As of July, that's just recently, Dadaab had a population of 218,870 registered refugees and asylum seekers. The Dadaab refugee camp was established in 1991 when refugees were fleeing the civil war in Somalia and started to cross the border into Kenya. So when the war broke out, it was all over Somalia. People were escaping to Ethiopia while others were escaping to Somalia, and people started coming to Dadaab. Dadaab on its own, without the refugee camp, Dadaab on its own is a city on its own. It's a small town, so it's not really a city, but a small town, and people started coming in. And it's on the northeastern province of Kenya, which is highly populated by the Somali community who are living in Kenya. So when people started coming in, they started coming in 1990, and when the war started in 1991, the camp was filled with people, asylum seekers, and people trying to flee the war with hope of going maybe back. And this was supposed to be a short-term it was supposed to be a short-term camp to kind of like help these people to find refuge from whatever was happening back in Somalia. However, it became bigger. So we have people living in Dadaab, people who have lived in Dadaab for more than 30 years. They say people who have children and grandchildren within the camp, and they've been living as refugees. And these people this has been their home. There's some who have been born there and they don't know anywhere else except that camp, with that hope of like moving outside. There was a second influx of refugees that happened in 2011 when some 130,000 refugees arrived fleeing drought and famine in Somalia. So Somalia used to be, according to, I've always been told about Somalia growing up as a Somali, and Somalia used to be this place which was like, it was full of farmers. It was really, really beautiful. And I wish I could be able to I was trying to get pictures of Somalia before the civil war. It was really, really beautiful. It has started to rebuild, but it was really, really beautiful. And it was one of the biggest cities in Mogadishu, for example, which is the capital city of Somalia, was one of the biggest cities in Africa. And it was really, really beautiful, full of farmers and people were hardworking and all that. But when the war started, nobody was doing all this. And when the land isn't tilled for a long time, when it's full of like war and missiles and all that, what happens is the land also just deteriorates, and that's what happened to Somalia. So there was famine at some point because there was no farming taking place and everything, and people were fleeing the drought and famine. And there are three Dadaab camps. There are three camps which are in Dadaab, which are the Gahale, Ifo, which was a lot of what we saw. We saw a bit of the Gahale, and we saw Ifo, which was where Omar and his brother Hassan were living, and the whole community around him. And there's also Hagadera. In 2011, there were other two camps that were opened, but they closed down after the population decreased, because so many people joined the refugee camps after the famine and drought. So the two are located in the Lagdera, which is the Dadaab district, while Hagadera is located in the neighboring Fafi district. So I'll just speak a bit to this. I always was told about the story about what was happening during war and whatever was happening when people were fleeing. I have had that opportunity, even though I haven't myself lived as a refugee. I'm married to my husband who passed through that experience. Even though he didn't come through Dadaab, he went through Ethiopia, and he talks about running, like how that experience was, fleeing the war and walking through the wilderness all the way to Ethiopia and trying to find some refuge right there. And that experience was really, really traumatic. And when I was preparing for this, it took me time. Nobody wants to relive that. Nobody wants to talk about that. And I have relatives too who I tried reaching out to, but it's hard for people to talk about these kinds of experiences and to talk about war and to talk about what happened during that moment, which was really, really traumatic for them. So what was beautiful about this book, after just mentioning a brief history, what was beautiful about this book was about the stars, when stars are scattered, and how they were talking about the poem that was behind that book, and the poem that was talking about that beautiful flag of Somalia. And I just put the flag up there to kind of explain more about what it's being talked about. There's a high population of Somalis living outside Somalia and in most countries in America, in Canada, and they found refuge somewhere else apart from Kenya. So we have so many people who fled, and this was like really, really interesting to read about that poem. They talk about those who look into the stars to lead them home. The flag of Somalia, our home, has one star, as you can see, and one background. But we are not one star, we are millions, and not one background, but millions. And that is in that page 255 for those who want to refer to it. And to the untrained eye, the night sky is scattering of stars, a chaos of light and dark across the universe, and yet the stars are not lost. So it just talks about how many people have been able to find each other. There's so many people. Even when I first came to America, the first people who were able to, some of the first relatives I had were people who were able to come through that, who were able to find that a refuge, and who are able to come from distance, I mean from Somalia and all those places. And there were the people who we were able to briefly meet while they were in Kenya, and they were able to come to America and other places. So those were the first people who welcomed me through calls, and they talked to me. So I am happy. I was happy reading about this. So I got to talk to a friend of mine, and some friends of mine who are working in the Dadaab refugee camp. And these were the things they mentioned, talking about a life of a refugee in Dadaab, just to give perspective. These people face discrimination from the local communities. And by the local communities, even though the majority of the local communities are Somalis, the Kenyan government has been for a long time planning to close the camp because of the militia group, talking about the Dadaab camp being a training zone for the militia group of Al-Shabaab and all that. And that has been causing a lot of chaos. And that has caused a lot of chaos for the Somalis living in Kenya versus the ones who are living in the refugee camp. And that causes a lot of they face a lot of discrimination from the local communities because of that. Because life basically, we all look alike. Our names are the same. There's nothing that is different between a Somali who's living in Somalia versus one who's living in Kenya, apart from that aspect of citizenship, and apart from that aspect of knowing a second language, maybe like Swahili. But so it's really, really hard for the Kenyan government to kind of differentiate. Are you a Somali from Kenya, or are you a Somali from Somalia? And with the influx in the refugee camps, there has been a lot of people trying to find refuge somewhere else within Kenya, and that has caused a lot of chaos with the local communities, because they are also being scrutinized more with the Kenyan government, basically because of what's happening. So that's why some of them are facing a local discrimination, which is not fair at all. So there's also poverty. There's poverty because the dab is also in a really remote place, and it's surrounded by desert. That's why you find that these people are going to fetch water somewhere else. They're not able to afford shelter. As you can see in most of the pictures I will be able to share, they're living in tents. They're not able to afford shelter and other basic needs. There is restriction to movement. The people who are living in the camp cannot accept public movement. They can't move through they can't access public transport. They can't move. They're not allowed to leave the camp to go somewhere else within Kenya. The refugees either have the option to find refuge somewhere else or to go back to their homeland. And so many of them are very, very afraid of going back, especially when you find that everything was lost and with the trauma that has happened and everything that was happening. They're not able to build permanent houses because that is a camp and it was supposed to be a temporary place. They're not supposed to build permanent houses. They're not able to access public resources. They're not able to access resources that are there in the country. So, which means they're just kind of in their own bubble, even though right now I saw a radio station there. I've seen electricity has started going there. There's some of the basic needs that have started, and some other resources that have started being there, but they can't access the resources that are there within the country they're seeking refuge in, within Kenya, basically. They're not able to get permanent jobs. So even though they get an achievement, even though they achieve academically, even though they're able to complete school and all that, they're not able to get permanent jobs. And that's why you find that there's that whole issue of the young boys being able to being recruited into the militia groups, and them going through these. We saw in the book where some of the boys were sitting in the hut area. So hut is a form of it's a form of, will I say it's a drug? It's something that they chew, and it's a drug that they're able to chew. It's made of leaves that they're able to chew, and it's culturally there in Somalis. Like, it's a cultural thing that most Somali men take that, but there's that whole level where it reaches the abuse of the drug, because people take the drug the whole time. People sit down and chew cut the whole time that they're sitting there, because of not finding a job, because of not finding the available resources. And this is basically it becomes a problem. So I'm just going to give a preview of the book, and just a short preview. So we see the book talking about Umar. Umar is living as a refugee with his brother Hassan, who is disabled. They have a foster mother, Fatuma, who has also lost four of her sons from civil war. Umar is as he's staying in the camp, and he's a young boy, and as he's staying in the camp, trying to plan his way back home and thinking about how he's going home, and he doesn't have anything else he's thinking, and he's thinking about his mother. And his brother has also undergone that trauma, and the only word that he can mention is hoyo, which means mom in Somali. He meets Salan, who is a community leader, and Salan talks about Omar going to school, but Omar is thinking about being a farmer, and he doesn't even think about going to school. And he's also afraid because of his brother, because his brother is also experiencing, as we can see, some seizures, and he's not well. So he wants to take care of his brother, because he's trying to keep also his word to his mother, who asked him to take care of his brother. So he gets a chance to be interviewed by the UN. Later on, Omar goes to school finally, and he's able to make friends. He's able to meet people from the community, which I'm going to talk about as I'm talking about the themes around. He meets a friend even called Jerry, and he is able to interact with other people from the community. And school doesn't seem as easy as it is, because you either perform or you don't. So it's basically like survival for the fittest. So he has to perform better in school to keep being in school. And then he learns about America, and he talks about this common Somali word called bufis. And as I was reading it, and I was telling my mind, when he starts fantasizing about his life in America, I kind of like talk to myself, and I'm like, this is a lot of bufis. And later on I read, and it's talking about the word bufis, which means when someone is fantasizing so much about living outside their own land, especially like living in Africa, and then you're fantasizing so much about living abroad. So that's called Buffet. So he is so much, he has that hope of going, because he finally realizes that he can't go back home. So he is really having these plans of going to America. And he finally gets a chance to be interviewed by the UN, and this gives him so much hope of going to America. And as he waits for his name to appear, for the second time, apparently you wait for your name to appear several times. It doesn't do that. Fine, it doesn't happen eventually for him. It doesn't happen like immediately. It takes time. So he keeps going to school, and he is able to finish high school with his friend Jerry. And finally, the book ends when he is finally able to get that opportunity and come to America. And for those who have not been able to see, there are a lot of interviews where he is able to talk to people about he is able to talk to people about how life was and his whole journey. And it's also written there how he moves to America. And later on, he moves to America with the assumption that perhaps his mother could be dead. And then he finally realizes, like when you read towards the end, his mother comes looking for him after years. When he's in America, he finally has word that his mother there was a woman looking for two of her sons, which happens to be the mother. And the mother comes there, and and she is still in Dadaab apparently. And he has been able to go back to do a lot of community service and help other students there. And he is trying to also process the papers for his mother. Apparently, unfortunately, it can't happen as soon as we thought it could, because of the ban that was made, and a lot of refugees are unable to resettle, unlike before, how they were able to resettle to America. So the themes that I will be talking about will be the themes of culture and community, the theme of education, the theme of hope and trauma, the theme of poverty, gender inequality, and privilege. Privilege will not be, I want to be talking about privilege more of a theme, but I thought that one thing that perhaps students can be able, especially young students, can be able to take from this book is thinking about privilege. Because when I lived in America, I think about privilege in a different perspective. But when you read about this, when you read this book, you think about privilege in a whole different perspective, as compared to what we were thinking about before. So I will start with the theme of culture and community. And there was a lot of expression of culture and expression of community. I mean, there was a lot of expression of culture through what they were talking about in the book. So I took some of the quotes from the reading, and I will kind of like talk about them. So there's a quote that talks about we may be refugees and orphans. When Omar is talking about this, and he says we may be refugee and orphans, but we're not alone. God has given us the gift of love, which is that whole community, that whole aspect of community. When Omar was going to school, you find that the I mean the whole camp, that wherever he was living, the whole place, people were taking care of um people were taking care of Hassan for him, and that included Mariam. And they were able to take care of Hassan when he was going um to school and all that. And there was that whole aspect. Somalis are very, very communal people, and um according to I understand that we love we love staying together, whether like for example, so many people find refuge. Like if you go to I have been able, and I have a lot of relatives living in Minnesota. I find there's a lot of Somali population there, where people are able to take care of each other. I saw that whole aspect where Omar is able to walk into someone else's house, and they're welcoming you for a cup of tea. And even despite that whole situation that they're living in, despite that whole, think about them living in a poor situation and not being able to afford, I mean, the basic needs. But the little that people have, you find that people are welcoming, and people are able to call you to their house. I mean, like, he's able to be invited in I mean, like, when he goes to his friend's house, and he's able to feel at home there. We see Fatuma, who takes care of Omar and Hassan, even though she's not related to them in any way. And at some point, we see that when they arrived, we kind of learned that there were so many people who were telling who were telling her rather, that how can you take care of these kids who are not your kids? How can you and there's one who is sick. How will you deal with this kid who is sick? And Fatuma just made that decision to kind of take care of Omar and Hassan, and you see that she's making them food. She is that mother figure, and she's acting like a mother to them, even though she is not at all related to them. Um, and again, as I mentioned, Mariam and the neighbors take care of Hassan when Omar is going to school. There's Omar's journey from Somalia, where he's taken care of by a neighbor. When there was an attack in Somalia, when Omar was we understand that we learned that whatever happened was that Omar was with his father. Um, he was with his father in the farms, and then the rebels came, and he saw his father being shot. And then he ran to come and tell his mother. His mother told him, take care of your brother and go to so and so, go to the neighbor to be taken care of. And you see that this neighbor holds their hand throughout the journey, throughout the wilderness. They're taken care of by that whole group. They kind of take care of each other. They kind of hide together. They kind of move together until they reach that whole camp. They reach the Dab refugee camp. There's also the culture of storytelling, which is and poems. They talk about poems a lot, but they talk about Somalia being the land of poets. The language is so beautiful. There are a lot of poems about, I mean, like about the war, about whatever was happening and all that. So they haven't been mentioned, but they've just briefly mentioned about the whole poetry poetry situation. But there's also that culture of storytelling. You see Fatuma sitting down at some point talking about her life in Somalia, and that happens from time to time. From elders, we believe that we learn from elders. um, there's the pastoralism. Somalis are normal pastoralists, and they are known to take care of goats and sheep and camels for those who can afford. And you see that the first, I think they start keeping, and they're able to get a goat, and which gives birth, and they're able to get milk from that, and they're able to live with that throughout and get their own they're able to live with that. As the book expands, you see them being moving forward with, I mean, as they're living with the god, they're getting more gods, and like these, like that whole, animals are kind of like a source of wealth, and they're a source of income. So there's that whole pastoralism taking place. The nicknames, I don't know, and I have looked all around. I don't know any Somali who I know in my life who doesn't have um, a second nickname, a second name, nickname that they were being called growing up. It's part of the culture. They use nicknames through the language. They use nicknames through all this. So that whole talking about nicknames and giving nicknames to each other has also been something that I saw from the book. Um, so I will be able to move. I was just checking if there's any. I've not been able to read the chat. I've just been speaking. So I will continue to the next slide. So there's also that theme of education, and education is mentioned um, to be it's basically one major aspect in this book, and how it is a privilege. Education is a privilege for people living in the refugee camp. Um, so there's that quote that says, "But even though school is loud and crowded and hot, I love it. It's like my brain was starving and now it's getting the food that it needs." Um, Students work so hard as they have hopes of a better future with education. You see that even though they're not able to, when it starts, we at some point are able to learn that these kids were learning under a tree, and which is something that happens in places where um, the community is not able to build a school. So these kids were learning under a tree, and you see as they mention, one of them mentions and say, "Look, that's where the school used to be, and it's under a tree." And they say, "No, look, now we have better school." But even though they have classes that have been built, it's really, really overcrowded. And the place being in a desert, it's really, really hot. I have been to Somalia, and I know, like, most of the weather, I mean, the weather there it's really, really hot generally. And northeastern province mostly is known to be hot, and that's why that most of the time you see that places like this, in the afternoon, classes and businesses are closed for a while, because of the heat, and they don't have like ACs or something. So you can imagine being in the middle of a desert, and maybe the roof is made of iron sheets, and how hot it is, and the students are overcrowded in a class. Um, and they're doing all this just because they want to get some education. Later on, we come and learn from Nimro that these students have that whole dream, and there are a lot of opportunities, mostly in refugee camps. Even in Kakuma refugee camp, I've seen these opportunities where students who perform better in the schools, the top students are given an opportunity to go to Canada, to a university in Canada or to a university in America. And we see from Nirmal that they've seen that was her dream before she was resettled. That was her dream, and with Mariam, that they wanted to go to Canada, and they were showing it to Omar at some point that, look, we are working so hard, we want to finish high school so that we can get this opportunity. And some of them are learning, even though there's some bit of hopelessness from um, some individuals within the community, but everybody knows that through education they're able to get better jobs, they're able to get even though they don't get jobs within the refugee camp, they know that it will open an opportunity. So not everyone is, again, not everyone is familiar with the value of education. Like Jerry's father, I want to add to talk about gender inequality and all that, but before, and that includes in education, and I'll talk about that theme shortly. You see Jerry's father being arrogant, and he is able to mention that there is nothing you're going to get with education. There's so many people who lose hope in the process of trying to get there, because they're trying to get opportunities. And like I said, if you know that you're not able to get a job unless you go back to your country or you find a refuge somewhere else, and getting a refuge somewhere else is a thing that you just long for and be hopeful about, but it's not like it's going to happen any moment. Like, it's something you're just hopeful about. You don't know when it happens, but you know it's going to happen soon. So there's that whole hope, but remember that they're not allowed to work there. So there's the theme of hope and trauma. And I would kind of like to narrate shortly. I was just reading the chat, and I will answer the question that is posed shortly as soon as I'm done. So I would like to, as I was mentioning, when the war broke, my grandfather, thank goodness, was able to flee Somalia back then. And he was able to elope with my grandmother. That's the story we are always told. And but we kept contact with our relatives, and that's why when I went to Somalia, I was able to see my relatives, and I know where we call it our roots, where my grandfather came from. So I remember when the war broke down, for those who are not able to get to a refugee camps, we had relatives coming and staying with us when I was young. And I remember when I was reading this book and seeing them having nightmares, I remember them screaming at night. And I didn't understand they were relatives from Somalia, and we were being told about the war that was happening and everything that's happening in Somalia. This has always been a story that is being narrated to us, and we're being told about it. So I was able to see this, especially there were men who were able to flee because mostly being a conservative society, women were not able to travel alone. Later on is when I saw women coming to get medication and help. But so we had this people, relatives who were coming through our homes. They were being hosted in our houses, and I remember them screaming at night and being afraid. And I remember asking my parents, and I was being told about the war that is happening, and they were part of it, and they were not able to sleep for a long time. Later on, I think they found help, because most of them were able to get opportunities to move abroad and other places, because they couldn't go back home. But when I was reading this and I was seeing people in the camp, and so many people are remembering, imagine seeing your immediate family member being shot right in front of you and you're supposed to run. It's traumatic. It's a traumatic event for most of them. And this kind of affects them psychologically, emotionally, and even like we can see Hassan, to the point that he's not even able to speak anymore. So I'll just after mentioning a bit about trauma, I'll talk about hope. So life is always the same in a refugee camp, except when it is not. Sometimes life can change in an instant, but you can never be sure if it's a good change or a bad change. So the amount of hope, and I was looking at Umar's interviews later on, and I was looking at what one other thing apart from privilege, one other thing that can be looked at, and one other thing that refugees have is hope. They always have hope of a better life. They always have hope that something better is going to come. And with this hope, they live with it every single day. And for some, it happens immediately. For some, it takes a while. Like we saw throughout the story, there is that story of hope. There is that whole journey of hope. So there is also that in a refugee camp, you're always reminded of the things that you have lost. It is a valiant and agonizing struggle to focus on what you have lost, but on struggle to focus not on what you have lost, but on what you have been given. So most of them, to get this hope, you remember Fatuma was telling Amar constantly, everything is going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay. There's also that aspect of religion, and you see people. They're all religion, and religion keeps them at least sane, and it keeps them going and it keeps them moving, because you can see like every single morning they're able to wake up, and there's that whole call of prayer 5 times within the camp. And that also tells us that religion is a big aspect, and it's part of the hope that they're having, that things are going to work out, even though there are moments that we see a bit of hopelessness, and that's when they're compared to a grain of sand. A refugee is like, you're like a grain of sand. So it's really hard for you to find the same, was it stone or grain of sand? It's really, really difficult for you to find the same stone or grain of sand once you have thrown it away. So they are 1 in a million. There's so many of them within that camp. So being selected is something that doesn't happen every single time. Hassan, as I said, because of trauma, Hassan is not able to speak, and most people are having bad dreams. And when I saw about bad dreams, I was seeing, I was just remembering what I've just seen from others. So okay, I'll move to the theme of poverty, which is one other thing that that was really, really reflected right there. Yeah, I just thought I had something else to mention about hope and trauma. I hope it comes back to me. So when we think about poverty, so you see on days like today, some kids just don't come to class. 3 kids fainted this morning already, because every 2 weeks we have empty days. So with the food they're given, it becomes difficult for them. One thing that really like went to my heart and was when we talk about poverty, was the aspect of not being able to find daily food, especially for children, and children fainting because they're not able to find meals. They're not able to get meals. And when they one other thing that was being mentioned over and over again, Somalis love tea. They always say we can drink tea for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you find that when everything was when they couldn't find anything to make tea, they were making tea from the back of a tree. And according to Omar, that was really not tasting the way it wasn't tasting good at all. They was also talking about when they were talking about E4, they were saying, "Don't be fooled. We don't have electricity here." I've heard that there's electricity has started moving, but it's not throughout the camp. They don't have electricity. They're not able to get electricity throughout. And then also seeing where they were sleeping. They were sleeping with. Have you ever tried to sleep with an empty stomach on a woven mat on the dirt? Well, take it from me, it's not easy. As I was even watching in that from the graphic novel, I mean from that whole picture, how they're sleeping on the ground. And now I took this picture out, the picture that is above. I took this picture from the internet just to kind of thinking about shelter. When the family has so many members, you find even the food becomes extra scarce. And there are a lot of kids who end up not having food and uh, um, medication. They're not even able to have medication, and they're not able to find medication as soon as they're supposed to, even when they get sick. So there's a lot of malnutrition going on. Being able not They're not able to get, like, a whole balanced diet. The food is out of donation. The food is being given. I remember Omar was mentioning, it's not the same food that we used to eat. They don't have a choice about the food that they're eating. They're given food, and that's what they're going to eat, and they're supposed to be thankful and grateful and move and eat that food. And you can also see even clothing. They're not able to get clothing. You see, Fatuma is the one who gets a cloth here, and at some point she even gets a cloth from a dead person, and Omar just wears it, and he says, "I thank God I don't know the person who was wearing this cloth, because this wouldn't be as it wouldn't feel okay as it does right now." So because of lack of this basic needs that basically I talk about, we take for granted, these things that we take every single day, not thinking twice. And these people are not able to find it every single day. So also there's that theme of gender inequality. We're able to see this throughout. So when we look right from the school, you find the girls, there are very few girls as compared to boys. So Omar talks about, I started noticing that when I'd fetch water before school, I'd see some of my classmates there too, but they were only girls. Mariam, so you find that girls are given chores, they're taking care of their siblings. When it reaches time for lunchtime, for example, when it reaches that lunch break, there are no girls around. They're not allowed to be kids. They're not there as kids. Apparently, they're supposed to go home and start doing the chores, start taking care of their kids, start cooking lunch for everyone. So the girls are not, are not in school, like school is not important for girls as it is for boys. We also see that Mariam is married off to an old man, Ali, despite her academic excellence. She's really excellent. And by reading this, this is not really something that happens in a refugee camp. This is an issue that happens culturally, where also when I was reading about why girls don't go to school at some point, no, when I was reading through experience, girls sometimes don't go to school because of, especially in these poor situations, because maybe when they reach reach that level where they're teenagers, through menstruation, they're able to lack basic needs, and that includes sanitary towels, and things like that. And I know these are things that go unmentioned in the book. Also, the whole girls going to school in the Somali culture, it's something that um, is is still ongoing, trying to convince on the importance of education for girls. And I know this has been there. Even personally, going to school was a fight. I thank God for my parents who also helped me fight for it. But going to school and getting married off early, it's kind of a thing that happens in the Somali community, because that's kind of like how the role of women. But things are starting to change slowly, and I hope things are going to change, because I remember living in fear throughout my school life. And it's the same thing. I can imagine being a refugee and being a Somali. There's that fear just doesn't go away. And this, we see this happening. Mariam being really, really clever and trying to really fight for her education, and having that dream and having her dreams taken away, to be married off early. So that also happens in school. So there's that going on throughout. So I will move to the theme of privilege. Um, so no, just to talk about this, and even when I was in Somalia, I remember being talked to. I mean, I remember talking to people, and people who were there. I remember like my aunties who were there before the war broke out, and they were mentioning one day everything was okay. Like imagine today, you're okay, you're living with everything is normal for you. You go for grocery shopping, you meet your kids, you do everything normally like you would. And then all of a sudden, something just, there's a militia, I mean there's a rebel group in your country, because of politics, because of something that you don't even understand. A war broke out, and everything changed within a week, within days. Places were burning out, people were being shot, women were being raped. Everything just changed. From this beautiful city, from this beautiful living in this beautiful homes, everything changed all of a sudden. And they were able to, some people were talking about how their lives completely changed. And right now, there's that whole aspect of rebuilding the country, but everything just happened all of a sudden. For those who are, not everybody knows about politics. For those who knew about politics, they saw something like this happen, but nobody really knew how bad it will be to date. So this book helps us to acknowledge our privilege through the eyes of a refugee. By seeing everything that is happening, we're able to acknowledge our privileges and know that this is not something that is selective. No one chooses to be a refugee. Those kids born within the camps are not choosing to be born within the camps. So I think one thing is to acknowledge our privileges and be grateful for the lives that we have, and also see how we can pay it forward. And something that I really forgot was that group that Omar works for. And he works with refugees, and it's where people can be able to get donations. I was supposed to copy that link and post it here, and I don't know how it skipped my mind. So we are able to see what we have as an advantage that is a struggle for people living in the refugee camp. So there's so much that we have, and I gave this book to my younger sister, and I told her, "Can you read it? And I want you to tell me about what you have. I want you to talk about your privileges. I want you to talk about what you have that other people don't have." So sometimes it's really, really important to remember these things. Even when teaching students about this book, it's something that is really, really important to look at. So I've spoken for a while, and I think I'll learn better from. I think I'll speak more to what's really important in the questions that I'm getting.
Sophia, thank you so much for that riveting and extremely informative presentation. We do have at least one question in the chat box, and I have at least a question that I would like to ask at some point. But I will start off with a question that we have from Kate Van Haren. And the question is there any sort of criteria for the 3 camps? Do orphan kids specifically go to one camp, or are people assigned to wherever there is space?
According to my understanding is that people are assigned. The refugee camps are not really there's no sort of criteria so far. The refugee in every camp, you will be able to find young people, old people, orphans, people who are like there's no specific camp for orphan kids. There's no specific camp for elderly people. They're all assigned. That's why you see there's an elderly person like Fatuma, and she's taking care of young kids, orphan kids like Hassan and Omar. Especially with the influx, there is no selection. I've not heard of a selection unless it started existing. But according to the knowledge I have so far, there is no specific selection on where people go to. I hope that answers the question. And if you have a follow-up question, I'll be glad to answer. You're on mute. Sorry.
Thank you. There is a comment in the chat box, but before I read that out, I would like to ask the teachers if they have taught the book or if they plan to teach the book, and if so, if they would like to share any information about their plans. And I will read the comments here and then ask my question because it's related to the comment we have from Leslie Bartlett. And she writes, one thing I appreciate about the book is that it's honest about the strengths of community and about the very serious challenges that refugees in camps face. I also felt like the little bit we learned about the author's life after leaving the camp helped to complicate the idea that the US is a promised land sort of place for immigrants. And related to this comment, I wanted to just state that you mentioned several themes from the book, including gender, inequality, poverty, hope, and trauma. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that being resettled in the US or elsewhere doesn't automatically erase these factors from their lives. So I wanted to ask you, I know you spoke about some people who had, that you hosted in your own home and witnessing the trauma that they were experiencing. So I wanted to ask if you know what resources were of help to those people in finding healing and overcoming some of the obstacles that they faced even after being resettled.
I don't know of outside resources, and I said the Somali community is a cultural community. It is really funny when I tell people I went to Somalia and people who have experienced war and trauma, And I felt so much at home, the storytelling, the culture of storytelling and the culture of community. And there are people talk to each other and talk about their stories and talk about their trauma. And that kind of helps within, after a while, that kind of helps them to move through. And as I said, I am married to my husband who I live with every single day. And when I was preparing for this, I was talking to him and asking him, hey, do you remember about the war and what happened when you were a kid? Like, and he talks about it sometimes. Sometimes he narrates it as a story, and through that story is what I was getting. But I couldn't get him to talk about um, this. It's something that people narrate. People are able to talk as a community, and there's that whole religious aspect that people are able to refer to religion. That's also something that Somalis practice Islam. Most Somalis practice Islam, and they kind of have that whole strong background on that. And that's why you saw that Omar was even able to go to, even within a refugee camp, he was able to go to an Islamic school where they were writing things. And I remember even growing up, that's a cultural yet religious thing where they're able to learn through this, they're able to learn religion. And through that, they're able to learn something about how to cope with, I mean, like they're able to be given hope, they're able to talk about things that are happening. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. And we've seen a few comments from teachers, some who are planning to use the book to teach, and some who are waiting for the Spanish version of the book to teach. Um, does anyone have any additional questions?
I would love questions because questions will help me talk better.
So while we wait to see if anyone else has an additional question, I will ask one that I have. I'm kind of still thinking it through, but I wanted to ask about the idea of home in the book and how that idea sort of shifts over time. So initially, when we meet the main characters, you know, he's the older brother, Omar, is talking about his original home and how he desires to go back to that original home. And while that desire doesn't seem to wane during his childhood, I think after the possibility arises for him to be resettled, he sort of starts dreaming about the future more than the past. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that shifting idea of home, or if you don't think that it shifted at all, but that maybe his priority just changed as he got older to figuring out what to do with his future versus going back to his original home and being a farmer like his father was.
Yeah, according to what I understood, that hope was there, that hope of going back home, until he, again, we talk, like Omar was able to know about his mother because someone came from Dadaab to come, and he was able to hear, he was asking for people who were coming from Dadaab, hey, have you heard about this? Because we are a communal society and we talk, right? And he was able to hear about the place where he used to call home that has already been destroyed. So there's no home anymore. He can't think of the aspect of home anymore. So that has to change. It gradually has to change, and home definitely has to change. For refugee, you don't know where home is anymore, because for them they call the dab home, but home can be Canada, home can be Sweden, like we see for other people, home can be America. Home changes according to where a life is, according to where they can find a life, according to where they can feel like they have settled, because they have not yet settled. They're trying to settle, but you can imagine it's like you're hanging in life in the middle. You're not really calling anywhere home yet. So I think that whole idea, home, according to what I understood, home is anywhere for a refugee. Home is where you are assigned. It's not where you choose. You might be assigned anywhere. So that's something I was able to see throughout that. And before I move to something else, this is something I would like to really mention. One other thing that has really kept refugees hopeful is the idea of having Ilham Omar as the House representative in Minnesota. She was in the Dadaab refugee camp. She was a person who was um, a refugee in Dadaab refugee camp, and just seeing how the refugees are living. And she was able to get an opportunity to come to America, where she is now a politician in America. She is fighting for, even when there was that ban that prevented refugees from getting resettlement, she has been the one who has been advocating for that, giving a voice to other refugees. There's also Halima Aden, who is a model, and um, though she has finally quit modeling, but she was not from the Dadaab refugee camp, but she was from Kakuma refugee camp, which is also another refugee camp in Kenya. And these are people who come from these situations, get lives in America, get lives in Canada, and are able to make a difference for other individuals back there. So these people give people who are in refugee camps hope. So I couldn't miss mentioning that. I wanted to include it too, but I kind of had to mention it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There are two more questions that I would like to ask before we round up for the evening, and I'll combine them so maybe you can answer them at once. We have a question from Kate Van Heeren and Kristen Montgomery. Are all kids without parents assigned a legal guardian? And what things would you recommend that teachers do to connect students to the Somali community here in the Midwest and help understand Somali culture better? And to continue that, how can we better serve our Somali students?
One thing for the teachers, one thing I've learned for the Somalis who are getting resettled is the English immersion program, which is what helps students, because according to how I understood, there are places which don't offer this. That's why a lot of Somalis move to Minnesota, because for most schools, they have that whole program. They come to America, you're given an opportunity, you're told, hey, go to school, and nobody really understands. And you can imagine these kids some of them cannot even speak English as well, let alone speaking English. There's that whole accent, the American accent, and the American, it becomes so overwhelming for so many people, according to the groups I talk to. And for so many people, this becomes overwhelming for them. So one thing that helps is the English immersion programs, which enable these kids to be able to learn the languages. And it's not only for Somali refugees, it's for refugees who are coming as immigrants to the United States, giving these opportunities within places like, I don't really know whether it exists in Wisconsin, but giving opportunities for these kids to be able to learn English, and to give them that opportunity to be able to learn, to adjust to this new environment that they're placed in. So the other, I think, what would you recommend that teachers do to connect students to the Somali community here in the Midwest and help understand the Somali culture better? One thing, and I thank the African Studies program, is I've always talked about the Swahili culture, and after going, I came and I was working with the African Outreach Program to teach about the Swahili culture. But one other thing that I missed to talk about is the Somali culture, and it's something that I'm trying to work on and speak more about the Somali culture. I think inviting guest speakers who are Somalis to talk about the culture, to talk about, and trust me, the culture is beautiful, the poetry and everything. I never really looked at it deeply because it was just my mother tongue. And when I went to Somalia and I came back and I was like, no, it's so beautiful. There's so much about my culture that I wasn't really looking at. And that is including the language, the storytelling, the stories that are there are amazing. So I think having these sessions where we can have outreach programs with people who understand the culture better, with people who know more about the culture, can really help understand the Somali culture better. I really don't know much. There's also a lot of resources in the internet, I guess, when it comes to talking about Somali culture and what is important for them and what's not. But it's really important to have someone to kind of talk about it, I guess.
Thank you once again, Safia, for your amazing presentation and your incredibly your incredibly detailed responses. And I'd like to also thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you once again to Essie and Carmen for providing tech support. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and please remember that the recording will be provided to you all shortly. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.